She struck him across the face in the middle of the courtroom, right in front of everyone. The sound of her hand meeting his cheek echoed like the snap of a flip-flop on hot pavement. For a moment, the entire room froze. The only sound was a sharp intake of breath from the bailiff. Then, in a shocking turn, the judge rose from his seat, shrugged off his robe, and handed it to the man who had just been slapped. "Proceedings will now begin," he said calmly. "And ma'am, you're about to regret that." The man's name was Raymond Dunley, a soft-spoken 56-year-old retiree who had moved to Maple Haven for peace, gardening space, and a quieter life. Before retirement, he'd worked as a law clerk and now spent his free time caring for bees. He also looked after his adult son, Lucas, who had a disability and relied on a motorized wheelchair. Lucas adored courtroom shows and had grown a large following online by explaining legal matters in ways ordinary people could understand. The trouble began with Janice Hargreaves, president of the local HOA, self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood order, and a woman with a flair for turning rules into weapons. She decided she didn't like Lucas, claimed the sound of his wheelchair was disruptive, so the ramp leading to their front door ruined the neighborhood's visual balance, and once even fined them for having wind chimes that, she insisted, disturbed pigeons. I know all of this because Raymond is me, and this is the story of how my son ended up presiding over the very case that began as harassment against us. 3 months earlier, Janice sent us a notice, printed on aggressively pink paper, demanding that we remove our wheelchair ramp because it supposedly clashed with the earth tone color scheme outlined in the HOA's handbook. I wrote back, politely, pointing out federal housing laws and the Americans with Disabilities Act. That should have been the end. But Janice wasn't the type to accept losing. Her campaign escalated. She filed anonymous complaints about parking. Even though Lucas's van was always in our driveway, she labeled his ramp as unauthorized medical equipment. She even argued that the beeping noise his wheelchair made when backing up violated quiet hours, which she had apparently decided started at 3 in the afternoon. Her boldest move came when she tried to evict us using something she called the Visual Tranquility Clause, a rule she appeared to have invented from thin air. Each time, I replied with carefully worded letters quoting actual statutes, case law, and precedents. Lucas threw himself into the research, turning our responses into material for his online audience, which had grown into the tens of thousands. That only made Janice more furious. She began scheduling surprise HOA meetings at dawn on weekends, spreading rants on community forums about weaponized disabilities, and even tried to shut down Lucas's online presence by claiming his videos were tanking property values. The opposite was true. Homes in Maple Haven were actually selling at higher prices, but facts had never been her strong suit. Eventually, she started leaving notes taped to our door. Most were passive-aggressive, some outright insulting. One read, "Just trying to keep our neighborhood beautiful." Another said, "Some people care about property values." But the most telling one was scrawled with, "Handicap doesn't mean hand and cap," a nonsensical jab that revealed her prejudice more than anything. Lucas recorded everything. His ongoing series, which documented our HOA nightmare, began attracting hundreds of thousands of views. Law students used our case for assignments. Even a Georgetown professor reached out, interested in including it in academic materials. Then Janice went too far. She filed a lawsuit accusing us of damaging community morale and lowering property values. She demanded $30,000 in compensation and insisted Lucas testify so the court could see firsthand how his existence was, in her words, a detriment to the neighborhood. Her lawyer, visibly uncomfortable, tried to dissuade her, but Janice was convinced this was her winning move. The case was assigned to a local circuit judge, who quickly recused himself. He happened to be a follower of Lucas's work and had once commented online praising the guy in the wheelchair. That left the next substitute judge in rotation to take over. Here's the part Janice never saw coming. 6 months earlier, Lucas had finished his law degree, passed the bar, and been appointed as a part-time substitute judge to help with a backlog of civil cases. His duties were usually small claims or minor contract disputes, nothing high profile. But in her obsession, Janice had overlooked the simplest fact. The young man she tried so hard to push out of the neighborhood was not only legally protected, He was now the one with the gavel in his hand. On the day of the hearing, we made sure to arrive early. Lucas was scheduled to sit in as an observer for the preliminary proceedings. Since his official assignment to the case hadn't yet been determined, the substitute judge who should have presided was delayed due to an unexpected medical emergency. A little later, Janice entered the courtroom, parading in as though it were her personal stage. She wore a loud purple suit that looked like it had been scavenged from a forgotten department store sale decades ago. When she spotted Lucas seated quietly in the gallery, her expression hardened to the same shade as her outfit. She stomped over, sneering, and called him nothing more than a mascot for pity. Lucas, composed as always, replied that he was there in an official observing role. She barked out a laugh that grated on the ears, then loudly announced that people with disabilities didn't belong in courtrooms unless they were there as victims or defendants. She accused him of turning his presence into a performance. The bailiff began to move in, but before he could, Janice doubled down. Pointing at Lucas, she declared that his disability was just an act, that he could walk if he wanted to, that the wheelchair was nothing but a prop for sympathy and government assistance. And then, without hesitation, she slapped him. The crack of her hand against his cheek cut through the room like a gunshot. I was standing a few feet away, holding a container of lemon bars I had brought for the clerks, when the entire courtroom froze. The bailiff's hand went to his radio. The court reporter stopped mid-keystroke, and the presiding judge, who had just walked in and seen everything, stared in disbelief. The judge looked at Lucas, then at Janice, then back at Lucas. Without saying a word, he walked over, slipped off his robe, and handed it to my son. Lucas adjusted his glasses, settled the robe on his shoulders, and said evenly, "Let the record show, striking a court officer is not only a felony, but also incredibly foolish." The bailiff immediately arrested Janice, while she shrieked that she hadn't known Lucas had any official role. She claimed we had staged the whole scene to humiliate her. The officer, who looked like he'd seen more than enough nonsense in 2 decades on the job, simply read her rights and led her away. The lawsuit crumbled then and there. Lucas, recusing himself because of personal involvement, handed the matter to a replacement judge who had been called in. That judge, Patricia Chun, wasted no time. After reviewing the evidence, she came down harder than anyone expected. She meticulously listed Janice's misconduct, harassment, discriminatory fines, fabricated rules, intimidation, and finally the assault. She identified multiple violations of federal disability protections, numerous breaches of state law, and called it one of the clearest cases of deliberate discrimination she had ever seen. The penalties were severe. The HOA itself was fined $250,000. Janice personally owed another $100,000, plus she faced criminal charges for assault. The board was ordered to completely rewrite its policies under the guidance of accessibility experts, and every member who had backed Janice's campaign was stripped of their position and banned from serving on any board for 5 years. The management company lost its contract entirely. Janice was banned permanently from holding any HOA role in the county and sentenced to 3 years of probation on top of the assault charges, which carried the possibility of prison time. When Judge Shin added that Janice alone, not the HOA, would have to cover all legal fees, an additional $75,000, Janice's face drained of all color. She swayed, let out a pitiful wheeze, and collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut.